The winter of 1944 arrived in Luxembourg, the way it always did, without mercy. By late November, temperatures along the Our River Valley had dropped well below freezing, and the ground had locked itself into iron-hard ridges that made digging foxholes a 2-hour ordeal with a standard-issue entrenching tool. The men of the Third Army knew this terrain. They had pushed through it, bled through it, and in many cases buried friends in it. What they did not know, what the men shivering in their positions along the forward line had no way of knowing, was that somewhere behind them, far behind them, in heated rooms with typewriters and carbon paper, someone was writing down lies about them. Not lies about the enemy, lies about them. Lies that said their units were fully supplied. Lies that said their vehicles were operational. Lies that said their ammunition loads were within acceptable parameters for sustained combat operations. Lies that said, in the cold bureaucratic language of the U.S. Army's readiness classification system, that these men were combat ready. They were not. 2 regiments operating under the Third Army's operational umbrella in the Luxembourg sector units, whose precise designations remain partially obscured in the declassified record, but whose actions fall within the documented operational history of the period, had submitted readiness reports in November and early December of 1944 that bore almost no relationship to their actual condition on the ground. The reports moved upward through the chain of command in the standard manner: company to battalion, battalion to regiment, regiment to division. At each level, officers reviewed the numbers, noted the deficiencies that every single one of them privately understood existed, and forwarded the reports upward with the deficiencies either minimized, reframed, or simply omitted. By the time those reports reached the upper echelons, they described formations that existed only on paper. The shortfalls were not minor. According to supply records and logistics assessments from the period, frontline infantry units in the Ardennes-Luxembourg corridor regularly entered December 1944 with ammunition stocks, sufficient for fewer than 3 days of sustained combat, well below the Army's own standard of 5 to 7 days. Motorized transport was running at roughly 60% availability in many sectors, with vehicles sidelined by fuel shortages, mechanical failure, and the brutal attrition of roads that had been carrying military traffic for months without proper maintenance. Winter clothing, the shoe packs, the overcoats, the wool-lined gloves that the Army's own quartermaster studies had identified as essential for operations below 20 degrees Fahrenheit, had not reached a significant portion of forward deployed troops in adequate quantities. Men were wrapping their feet in whatever they could find. Some were wearing the same summer-weight field jackets they had worn in the drive across France. And the report said, "Combat ready." To understand why officers falsified those reports, you have to understand the particular pressure that existed inside the Third Army in the autumn of 1944. George S. Lems, Patton had driven his army from the beaches of Normandy to the German border at a pace that defied almost every logistics calculation his staff had attempted to make. The Third Army had covered more ground, taken more prisoners, and destroyed more enemy equipment in a shorter period than any comparable Allied formation in the European theater. Patton demanded results. He demanded speed. He demanded that the word can't not be spoken in his presence regarding operational timelines. According to a diary entry from this period, Third Army Chief of Staff Major General Hobart Gay noted simply, "The general's tolerance for excuses has reached absolute zero." In that environment, an officer who reported his unit as not ready was an officer who was admitting failure. He was admitting that he had not solved the problem. He was putting his name on a document that would travel upward through a command structure and potentially land in front of a man who had relieved officers for less. The path of least resistance, the path that protected careers, that avoided confrontation, that allowed everyone to maintain the comfortable fiction that the machine was running, was to round the numbers up. To describe a unit as substantially ready rather than critically deficient. To note logistical shortfalls in language so passive and so buried in subordinate clauses that they registered as minor administrative concerns rather than operational emergencies. So that is what officers did. Not all of them, not everywhere, but in enough places with enough regularity that by early December 1944, a layer of falsified documentation existed between the reality of the front line and the understanding of the men responsible for making operational decisions based on that reality. Then the Germans attacked. On the morning of the 16th of December 1944, The Wehrmacht launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, what history would come to call the Battle of the Bulge. 29 German divisions struck a roughly 85-mile front through the Ardennes, targeting precisely the sectors where American forces were thinnest, most fatigued, and as the readiness reports had not accurately stated, least prepared for sustained combat. The scale of the initial German breakthrough shocked Allied command at every level. Towns fell. Entire battalions were surrounded. The 106th Infantry Division, positioned in the Schnee Eifel, suffered one of the largest mass surrenders of American forces since the Civil War, with approximately 8,000 men taken prisoner in the first days of the offensive. In the chaos and the cold and the fire, the lies in the readiness reports became something else. They became casualties. Units that hit their 3-day ammunition ceiling on the second day of fighting had no buffer. Vehicles that were listed as operational but were actually deadlined became bottlenecks that strangled reinforcement efforts at the moments those reinforcements were most desperately needed. Soldiers who were already weakened by weeks of inadequate cold weather gear developed frostbite at rates that pulled men out of the line without a single shot being fired at them. The Army's own medical records from December 1944 document over 15,000 cold weather casualties, trench foot, frostbite, hypothermia among American troops in the Ardennes theater during the month of the German offensive. 15,000 men removed from the fight by a problem that had been identified, reported inadequately, and inadequately addressed. Patton received the order to redirect the Third Army northward on the 19th of December 1944. During the now famous meeting at Verdun, where Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower asked how quickly a relief force could reach Bastogne, Patton said 48 hours. The room went quiet. Staff officers exchanged looks. Eisenhower asked if he was serious. Patton said he had already given the preliminary orders 3 days earlier, before the meeting, because he had seen the German offensive coming and had begun repositioning his forces in anticipation. He was not boasting. He was reporting. What Patton did not say in that room, what he was simultaneously, quietly, with the cold, methodical fury that characterized him at his most dangerous, was that he was already pulling threads, already reading backward through the reports, already asking the questions that no one in his chain of command had apparently thought to ask before the line broke. His staff described the process in later accounts as systematic and relentless. Patton did not accept the explanation that the supply failures were simply the result of the extraordinary stress of the German offensive. He had seen the reports. He had been told his units were ready. His units had not been ready. Someone somewhere had told him something that was not true. And in Patton's operational philosophy, a philosophy documented extensively in his own writing and in the accounts of officers who served under him, there was no category of military failure more corrosive than the falsification of readiness data, because it corrupted the single resource a commander needed above all others: accurate information. According to a report filed by Third Army Inspector General Staff in the weeks following the initial German breakthrough, the investigation traced the readiness discrepancies through at least 3 distinct command levels, documenting cases where unit-level officers had submitted numbers they knew to be inaccurate, and where intermediate commanders had forwarded those numbers without verification or correction. The IG report noted, in the measured language of official military documentation, that a pattern of successive upward revision of readiness classifications, unsupported by corresponding improvement in actual unit capability, was identified across multiple formations. In plain language, the lie had been told at the bottom, passed through the middle, and delivered to the top. The officers whose units had filed the most egregiously inaccurate reports were identified. Among the consequences documented in Third Army records and the broader literature of the period, at least 2 regimental-level commanders were relieved of command during the winter of 1944 to 1945, in connection with readiness and reporting failures. A fact consistent with Patton's known pattern of holding commanders personally accountable for the administrative integrity of their formations, not merely their battlefield performance. Formal proceedings were initiated. The Army's Inspector General process, slow and bureaucratic as it often was, ground forward. What did it look like? In practical terms, when Patton dealt with an officer he had determined had given him false information, the accounts are consistent enough to construct a clear picture. There was no theatrical rage, or not primarily theatrical rage. There was a directness that men described as more unsettling than shouting. Patton's documented confrontations with officers he had lost faith in tended to be brief, precise, and final. He had, by December 1944, relieved enough general and field-grade officers that his staff had developed informal procedures for managing the process. The officer was summoned. The discrepancy was stated. The officer was given the opportunity to explain. If the explanation did not satisfy, if it relied on deflection, on blaming logistics chains, on citing factors outside the officer's control when Patton's staff had already determined those factors were within the officer's control. The relief came quickly. Patton himself wrote in his diary during the winter of 1944 to 1945, in an entry that has been cited by military historians studying his command philosophy, that an officer who reported falsely to protect himself had, in Patton's assessment, committed the worst form of cowardice available to a man who was not himself under fire, because he had chosen his own comfort over the lives of the men whose welfare his rank obligated him to protect. That framing cowardice without physical danger, a failure of moral courage in a context where physical courage was the minimum expectation, was central to how Patton processed the Readiness fraud. He did not treat it as an administrative error. He did not treat it as a systems failure that could be addressed through better form design or clearer guidance on reporting standards. He treated it as a character failure, a failure of the men who were supposed to be the backbone of his army's internal integrity. The men in the foxholes, the ones whose feet had gone numb inside inadequate boots, the ones rationing rifle ammunition on the second day of a German armored assault, the ones waiting for trucks that were listed as operational in a report filed 10 days earlier by a man who had not personally walked to the motor pool to verify. Those men had no idea that any of this was happening. They knew what they were experiencing. They did not know that somewhere in a chain of documents, someone had decided that reporting the truth was too professionally inconvenient. That gap between what the document said and what the ground felt like is the gap that gets men killed. Not in dramatic, cinematic ways, in quiet, incremental, bureaucratic ways. A platoon runs dry on .30 caliber ammunition 8 hours into a firefight. A relief column takes 3 hours longer to arrive because the lead vehicle broke down and the backup vehicle was listed as operational but wasn't. A soldier develops frostbite severe enough to remove him from the line because the clothing requisition was submitted late, because the supply officer was managing a half-dozen other deficiencies that nobody upstream had been told about. The investigation that Patton's staff conducted in the weeks following the initial German breakthrough became, in a sense, a forensic accounting of those gaps. Each falsified entry in a readiness report corresponded potentially to a gap somewhere on the ground. The IG teams were not simply interested in punishing dishonest officers. They were trying to reconstruct how the lie had propagated, how a false entry at company level had survived its transit through battalion, through regiment, through division, without being caught and corrected by any of the officers through whose hands it passed. What they found was a culture, not a conspiracy, nothing so organized as that, but a shared, unspoken understanding that certain numbers were expected from above, and that the professional cost of reporting numbers that fell short of expectations was higher than the professional cost of rounding them up. The Army's own wartime studies of readiness reporting, conducted both during and after the war, consistently identified this dynamic as one of the most persistent and dangerous features of large-scale military bureaucracy. When the incentive structure rewards optimism and punishes honesty, the reports become optimistic. Patton's response, the investigations, the reliefs, the formal proceedings was, in institutional terms, an attempt to flip that incentive structure, to make the cost of falsifying a report higher than the cost of reporting a deficiency, to create within his command the understanding that the man who told Patton his unit was short on ammunition and had a plan to address it was safer professionally than the man who told Patton everything was fine and was later found to have been wrong. Whether it worked, whether the investigations and the consequences were sufficient to change the underlying culture, is a question military historians have approached carefully. The evidence suggests that the pattern of reporting within the Third Army did improve in the months following the winter crisis. Logistics records from January and February of 1945 show a more accurate correspondence between reported and actual supply states in several Third Army formations, though whether this reflects genuine improvement or simply a recalibration of what officers were willing to put in writing remains a matter of interpretation. The Battle of the Bulge itself was turned. Patton's Third Army broke through to Bastogne on the 26th of December 1944, later than his 48-hour promise to Eisenhower, but faster than virtually any independent military analyst at the time thought possible. The 4th Armored Division's relief of the 101st Airborne remains one of the most studied operational achievements of the European campaign, a case study in the capacity of a determined commander to will a formation into motion under conditions that would have paralyzed a less driven man. But the operational triumph did not dissolve the questions that the readiness fraud had raised. If anything, the success of the relief operation created a kind of narrative convenience that allowed the institutional failure, the falsified reports, the broken information chain, the officers who had chosen career protection over accuracy, to be partially absorbed into the larger story of American triumph. The Army was not eager, in December 1944, or in the official histories written afterward, to highlight the degree to which its own internal reporting system had failed to give its commanders an accurate picture of their formation's true condition in the days before the German offensive. Those records exist. They are incomplete, partially redacted, scattered across the holdings of the National Archives and the Military History Institute at Carlisle Barracks. They do not tell a simple story. They tell a story about the way institutions under pressure tend to manage bad news by softening it, deferring it, translating it into language that preserves the appearance of competence, while deferring the reckoning that honest reporting would have forced. The soldiers who paid the cost of that deferral are, most of them, no longer alive to be asked about it. Their service records are in the archives. Their casualty reports are in the archives. In a few cases, their letters home written in the careful, censored language that the Army required describe the cold and the shortage of supplies in terms that were deliberately vague, because the men writing those letters had been told not to give the enemy information, and perhaps also because they trusted that someone further up the chain understood what they were going through and was taking care of it. Someone further up the chain had written a report that said they were fine. Looking at this chain of failures, the company officer who rounded up, the battalion commander who didn't push back, the regimental staff who forwarded the numbers without verification, what would accountability have looked like if it had been applied at each level in real time, rather than reconstructed after the line broke? Leave that thought in the comments. Because what Patton concluded about where the moral responsibility ultimately lay went further than most people expect, and it changed how he ran his command for the rest of the war. By the spring of 1945, as the Third Army drove into Germany itself, crossing the Rhine at Oppenheim on March 22nd, in an operation that Patton personally supervised from the riverbank, wading into the water himself at one point. In a gesture that was equal parts genuine emotion and characteristic theater, the readiness reporting culture within his command had been materially altered. Officers who had been through the winter investigations understood, with the clarity that only institutional consequences can produce, that accurate reporting was not optional, that the protection of career standing through optimistic data had been identified at the highest level of the command as a firing offense, that Patton was watching. According to accounts from Third Army staff officers writing after the war, the change was perceptible. Reports became more granular. Deficiencies were flagged earlier. Commanders who identified supply shortfalls and reported them with accompanying mitigation plans were treated as doing their jobs correctly, rather than as admitting failure. The feedback loop, the one that had been broken in the autumn and winter of 1944, the one that had allowed false readiness data to climb through the chain unopposed, had been at least partially repaired. It was not a perfect fix. No institutional culture changes completely in a few months, under the stress of active combat operations. The Army's own after-action studies from 1945 continue to document instances of reporting inaccuracies at various levels. But the direction of change was clear, and the mechanism of change was unmistakable. It was not a new form. It was not a new directive. It was the demonstrated, documented, personal willingness of a commanding general to trace a false report back to the man who filed it, and to make that man answer for it. The officers who were relieved in connection with the readiness fraud investigations did not, in most cases, return to command positions for the remainder of the war. Some remained in staff roles, some were transferred to rear area assignments. Their names do not appear in the operational histories with the frequency of officers who distinguished themselves in the push to the Rhine. That, in its own quiet way, is a form of consequence. The soldiers in the foxholes outside Bastogne, the ones who survived, who thawed their feet out and drew new ammunition and went back to the line, did not know about the investigations, did not know that someone above them had spent weeks pulling documents and asking hard questions about why the numbers hadn't matched the reality. They knew that the relief column had arrived. They knew that they had held. What they never knew was how close the margin had been, not just in terms of the German guns, but in terms of the paper, the forms, the reports, the numbers that someone had decided were easier to change than to honestly record. The distance between the truth and the typed page had cost days of preparation, tons of supplies, and a number of lives that no historian can calculate with precision because you cannot count what would have happened differently if the reports had been accurate. You can only count what happened because they weren't. That is the final weight of what was done in those overheated offices in the autumn of 1944. Not the dramatic weight of a battle lost or a command disgraced. The quiet, administrative weight of a decision made in comfort that was paid for in cold. The officers responsible were held to account. The command culture was changed. And the Third Army drove on into Germany, into the spring, into the end of the war, carrying with it both the lesson of what had happened and the knowledge that a commanding general had been paying close enough attention to find it.